Hello and welcome to another installment of Music from Home, a series of videos created by musicians from the Yakima Symphony Orchestra. My name is Jeff Snedeker. I'm the principal horn of the orchestra, and the subject for this video is I think it's fascinating to know where an instrument comes from. And so what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about how brass instruments, and in particular the horn, the French horn, evolved. Obviously, there's a long history with lots and lots of details to try and fit into a reasonably a video of reasonable length. So there'll be a lot of stuff that we'll gloss over. But there are a couple of things that are, I think, very interesting from the standpoint of what all brass instruments have in common in terms of their history and their sort of evolution. And then how the horn in particular took on its own characteristics and sort of evolved as its own instrument. So let's see what we have here. The first thing that's important to realize is we really will never know exactly how things actually came about. But something happened a long, long time ago that inspired a human being to try and make a sound on an object that they found. What prompted that? What sequence of events? What inspiration? What thought popped into this person's head? We'll never know. But somewhere along the line, somebody was wandering around or on their way somewhere, and they looked down on the ground and they saw something that they had seen before, but for some reason it struck them as different. And you know, let's just say that our person was walking through, a wonderful sort of a agricultural area. And what they saw and what they, for some reason, were struck with was this. Something prompted them to see this as something different. The fact that it was hollow, by whatever means happened, that the small end had been broken off. That's one thing. I mean, perhaps it was used as some form of a cup where people would drink out of, but the bottom broke off and so it was discarded. But somebody thought, well, wait a minute, what would happen if I went like this? Maybe they even said, and they realized that the sound coming out of their mouth got a little bit louder, as like being amplified a little bit when they spoke through it. But then something must have prompted them to make a sound on it, right? Now, all brass instruments, today's brass instruments, are known as lip-blown instruments, in that the vibration of the lips introduces a vibration into the air inside a tube, and whatever frequency lines up with the end of the tube in terms of physical length, a sound is created. So here's a tube, right? Hollow. So by making that sound, somebody was inspired to think about what it might be useful for. Would it be useful for, say, making music? Well, it can only kind of get one note, so maybe not. But something did actually happen in that person's brain to say, if this travels farther than my voice, and the person on the other end of this here's some sort of signal that they understand what it means, perhaps we can communicate over long distances. And if a community is potentially threatened by some other community, They may need to communicate to each other over longer distances in a hurry to get a message across, right? So, logically, it's just a matter of constructing the signal so that everybody who hears it will understand what it means. And so then they can act accordingly, okay? Whether it's to gather together or to escape. Either way, that's how it seems to have started. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that this is something that we can understand when it comes to a region where farming is there, and perhaps there are cows. But what about a coastal region? You know, I don't remember, you know, sort of free-range cows walking across beaches or frequenting beaches, being sandy and all. There's nothing for them to eat, so why would they go there? But a coastal community might find something like this. All right? And it's also quite possible that the end gets broken off and somebody is inspired for whatever reason. Maybe they hear the wind blowing through it and they think, huh. And then they also buzz their lips and get a sound. So once again, in a coastal region, a found object, raw materials, is converted into something that's useful to the society. Interesting. Now, obviously, in other parts of the world, other things take place. So, for example, somebody finds this, right? This is a kudu horn from the continent of Africa. And it's a certain length. And this one has a hole in the side. It's also got a hole on the end, but don't worry about why that happened. But if I do the same thing, I buzz into it, I get a pitch. And if one finds a longer kudu horn, right, we can see that, and we go through the same operation here. Not as satisfying in terms of signaling a long distance, perhaps, but it makes a sound. But did you notice something about these? Listen. That's the short one. They sound kind of like the same note, don't they? They're actually an octave apart. And if I hold these so they sort of line up, you can see that the short one is about half the length, roughly, of the long one. And they are built that way on purpose because, in this instance, the purpose of them is to make sound that we might call music, as opposed to signaling, even though they certainly could be used. They could get some sort of sound to signal somebody. But notice that the pitches of this are different, yet related. Half the length means an octave higher, or a length shorter means notes that are higher, and half the length means twice as high, or an octave higher. Okay? So, interesting, different geographical region, different raw material, similar sort of use. Here's one more. We've seen these before, right? Right? Didgeridoo, right? Now, didgeridoo is interesting because it's made out of wood, right? And we know, if we know anything about these instruments, we know that there's a little bit of manufacture involved, as in coaxing termites in there to eat out the inside, to hollow it out, and then some craftsmanship that follows. Certainly this painting is wonderful, or this design here is really wonderful. But the result is, in a sense, the same. It's a lip-blown instrument that makes a sound. The hard part is we wouldn't associate that sound with signaling, but we might associate that sound with perhaps a musical purpose. Here's another one that's a little bit different. This one here is called a neferhorn. It's from Scandinavia, and it is made out of wood. You can see at the back there's a wood here, and then wrapped in bark to make it airtight. And it also has some ceremonial or some other sort of cultural functions within villages and so forth. So, and it not very loud, but again, people have different purposes for these sorts of things. So the social function is very important. As you might expect, though, at the root of all this is the idea of that lip blowing through a tube like that has its sort of primary function, at least most useful function to a community, as a signaling device. And so people would use the raw materials, they would begin to fashion them to sort of create more of those types of things, whether for ceremonial purposes, signaling for protection, or other sort of cultural uses. They made them out of ceramics, they made them out of clay, they made them out of glass. They certainly fashioned them out of wood, but where things really sort of took off, especially from a function standpoint, is when people began using metal for them. And they tried all the different kinds of metal that they could come up with, and some worked better than others. Some were too heavy, some were kind of thick and dense and didn't really resonate, but others definitely, like brass, for example, really found the right balance of being able to be sturdy enough and yet resonant enough to serve that sort of function. And as you might expect, the first ones were, when they figured out how to make tubing, they're very straight. This one is a little more decorative than actually historically accurate, but it shows what happens when you make a straight tube and you want to play it. Looks very ceremonial. Right? So we can, get that to work, and with a better player or a more practiced player, we could get some really interesting signals. But the fact remains that when metal came on the scene, it really did sort of elevate the options that people had for signaling devices. Now, the big change that happened during the Middle Ages was that again, when you have a straight instrument, it's very useful. But as you might expect, if a longer instrument provides us with a little more ease in playing, it actually produces a few more notes because of something called a harmonic series, which the longer the tube, the lower the overall pitches, which means the pitches are actually more physically playable for human beings. Every piece of tubing has a harmonic series. It's just a question of whether a human being can actually play it. But just take my word for it, the longer the tube, the easier it is for humans to play those various notes in that harmonic series. So the result is that that people had to sort of figure out, well, I can make a straight tube really long. How am I going to, make it so that if I want it to be really long, how can I make it portable? And the answer was, of course, figuring out how to bend tubing without folding it, so that the tubing would be maintained. Two shapes seem to rise to the top. One was a more oblong shape, looking like this, and that's what we associate with trumpets, and a round shape, which is associated with instruments called horns, perhaps for its sort of shape that's reminiscent of a cow horn or a ram's horn or something like that. But trumpets, on the other hand, had this oblong shape, and that in itself created a little bit of resistance within the tubing just because of its nature, and the result was a little more strident tone, and that was of really important use for the military, because with more piercing tone, one could hear across a battlefield, which, life and death is a little bit, worth protecting there. So that instrument became associated with the military, whereas the round instrument had a little more mellow tone to it, and still served the use of signaling, but it was sort of assigned, so to speak, to the hunt. Now, in hunting, you need signals for a couple of reasons. Much like in a military situation, you're going to deploy people, but you're also going to try to avoid putting each other in the line of fire. You also want to communicate what to look for and what's going on. Over the course of time, a number of really sort of nuanced and complex signaling or signals, systems of signals came into being to help people communicate in the same way that one might communicate on a battlefield. What did those instruments look like? Well, again, the important thing was, could we bend them and preserve the tubing so that they were portable, right? And that, like I said, that definitely happened. The trumpets, again, folded like this. The horns took on a round shape like this one. This is called a Parforcehorn, and it is designed specifically in the hunting horn tradition. You play it, especially if you practice it, it gets better. But the idea is that by making this long coil, it's actually more portable. You can see that because I can hold it, right? And it's pretty long. It's like at least 9 feet long. But there's another part to it. I would be on horseback. And the idea of holding this all of a sudden gets a little weird, better than a 9-foot straight tube. There we go. So I just got to make sure I stop my horse before I decide to play. So that's a Parforcehorn. Here's another from a different region, also in Europe. Here's a smaller hunting horn. Right? And a little brighter sound, a different tradition, but same social function or cultural function as a hunting horn. And you can see it's rounded shape, lots of conical tubing and so forth. That's what that looks like. There is a compromise, this one right here, between the huge hoop that's a little less wieldy and the smaller one, which is easy to manage, but a little more awkward to play. This one sort of splits the difference. And this is the type of horn that people heard in a variety of settings. Probably the favorite setting was to hear hunting music, music that was inspired by these hunting calls, that provided some nostalgia and some nice feelings at the party after the hunt when we were enjoying the spoils of the event. People would play, they would have songs with words to sing about how great it was, and the doe was, or the deer was brave, but we were braver, and that sort of thing. But this instrument, again, a sort of a split between the big hoop and the small hoop, provided, I think, the more likely instrument to play musical things. Now, this is important because in the next video, we're going to talk about how this instrument moved from the field into the orchestra, and then what happened next. So I hope you've enjoyed this much. Come back for part 2. In any event, I look forward to seeing you at a Yakima Symphony concert very soon.